Dear audience, welcome to this show POWERchat. In today's episode, we'll be discussing about SheDecides, a global movement. Joining us today is Ms. Naisola Likimani, lead of the SheDecides Support Unit based in London, United Kingdom. Please allow me to welcome her. Welcome to the show, Ms. Likimani.
Thank you, Laxman.
How have you been?
Very well, thank you. Happy to be in Nepal.
Well, you have been here for last a week.
Yes.
And discussing about the SheDecides movement. Could you tell us about this movement itself?
Absolutely.
What is SheDecides movement?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for having me on your show. SheDecides was born 2 years ago, in 2017, when the US president declared what we call the global gag rule, which is a rule where organizations that receive health funding from the US government cannot do any work around abortion. And this is what sparked the movement, because it was going to really impact, and it is impacting, a lot of the funding that goes to organizations working on HIV, on family planning, but even those working on other health issues like malaria and others. And so this sparked the movement because at the time, the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lilian Plumen, felt that this was unacceptable, that a decision was being made that was going to really affect women and girls, but they didn't have any say in it. And so SheDecides was born. And it's a movement, it's a political movement that says that every girl and every woman has a right to decide about her body, her life, and her future without question. And that is SheDecides.
Well, this is really interesting, Ms. Likimani. So this movement started from the decisions that were made for girls and women, but they were not engaged in the decision-making process. Do you mean that?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been going on for a long time now, where the issue of women's bodily autonomy are not really being taken very seriously. We've had decisions that have been made all the way from 1994, for example, when we had the International Conference on Population and Development, where it was said that this is a right, that women and girls have the right to choose what happens to their bodies. And this includes the right of who to marry, when to marry, the right to have children, if you have children, how many, the right to be free from violence, for example, the right to have sex or not and who to have sex with. And these are very fundamental rights, but they have not been really respected over the years. And that's why we still have very women dying from preventable causes, like maternal mortality, for example. We see very high rates of unintended pregnancies. We see, even in this region, lots of early marriages and forced marriages. And so this movement is saying we're taking a stand, that it's time for us to put the decision back where it belongs, and that's in the hands of women and girls. Yeah.
How do you see the status of women and girls in relations to, their rights at the global level?
I will say that there's been some progress over the years. I think we've seen that over time there has been reduction in some of the issues I've mentioned. We've seen, even here in Nepal, a reduction in maternal mortality rates. But what we're still seeing is that it's not enough. We should never accept even one woman dying from a preventable cause, for example. We see that there are really great laws and policies that are meant to guarantee these rights and to really respect this individual right to live a life of dignity. But the implementation of these laws and policies is normally lacking. And this is why SheDecides is based on 3 very important pillars. The first one is about standing up and speaking out. We want everybody from every walk of life, not just NGOs, every walk of life, politicians, development partners, governments, the UN, individuals in media, young people, to stand up and speak out and claim this as a right. Let's use very positive language, because we want this to be a very different kind of movement. The second issue is we want to change the rules. This is the second pillar. Change the rules for us means that where there are laws and policies that are either not being implemented or that are actually a barrier to women realizing their bodily autonomy, we must change them. The third one is unlocking resources. So this is the third area for She Decides. We need to make sure that there are resources that actually support the rights for women. Where there's a policy, it must be accompanied by a budget so that we can see access to family planning, we can see services, HIV prevention and response. These all need resources so that she indeed can decide without question.
Could you also tell us about the response made towards this movement? It's already been 2 years from different stakeholders, including governments and NGOs or UN agencies.
Yes, the response has been phenomenal. I think it exceeded even the founder Lillian Plumin's wildest dreams, because just 2 years after She Decides was launched, we've seen 120,000 people all over the world from over 180 countries sign our manifesto, sign up to our call to action, which is our manifesto. We have 42 champions now, and champions are influencers and leaders around the world who have said they are going to take a stand, and that includes about 13 ministers who are actively every day using their influence, using their networks to push for changing of the rules, for more resources, and to make sure that she can decide. And even what's actually been really extraordinary is we're starting to see a lot of local movements spring up. It was She Decides Day on March 2nd, and we had our big flagship event here in Nepal that brought so many from the region to come together to discuss these issues. And at the very same time, we had local movements in Kenya, we had people in South Africa, in DRC. We have a question being asked in the UK Parliament about She Decides. We have so much that's happening because this is an issue that really touches the heart of so many. And so the local movements are springing up, and we really can start to see that it's beginning to spring up here in Nepal and here in South Asia because of being here over She Decides Day. I think we've seen the communities here have said this is something that they can work with to really make sure we advance the rights of women and girls and young people in particular.
What do you have in this manifesto, and how can the local organizations or individuals or movements link their activities to this manifesto?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. We have the manifesto available on SheDecides.com. And I'm going to read it because it's very short but very powerful. And this is the manifesto and our call to action as a movement. She decides whether, when, and with whom to have sex, to fall in love, to marry, to have children. She has the right to information, to healthcare, to choose. She's free to feel pleasure, to use contraception, to access abortion safely, to decide. Free from pressure, free from harm, free from judgment and fear. Because when others decide for her, she faces violence, forced marriage, oppression. She faces risks to her health, to her dignity, to her dreams, and to her life. When she does not decide, she cannot create the life she deserves, the family she wants, a prosperous future to call her own. We and you and he and they are uniting, standing together with her so that she can make the decisions that only she should make. Political leadership and social momentum are coming together like never before. But we can go further and we can do more. From today, we fight against the fear, we right the wrongs, we mobilize political and financial support, we work to make laws and policies just, we stand up to what is right. Together we create the world that is better, stronger, safer, but only if and only when she decides.
Well, what are the comparisons or distinctions of the women or girls in developed world and the developing or underdeveloped world, the countries like Nepal? And what are your suggestions for the countries like Nepal? When can she decide? And what environment the state actors or other stakeholders should create so that she decides?
That's a really important question. I think we still have really heavy statistics around the impact when women do not get to decide for themselves. So we have something like 1 in 5 women have been married by the age of 18. 1 in 3 women have experienced violence in their lifetime. We have over 20,000 women die a year from unsafe abortion. And it's costing us the lives and dignity of our women, but also it's costing our economies. We're not going to develop in the way that we want if half of our population can't live a life of freedom and choice. And so what we know is that we need policies and laws that protect these rights. And I think we have a really good example from Nepal. There's the wonderful act that was passed on the sexual and reproductive health to make sure that these rights are protected. In Nepal, you also have access to safe abortion that is legal under the law for certain provisions. And these are really a good example that other countries can emulate. Because when we have barriers, when women cannot access, for example, safe abortion services, and they're forced to use very crude methods, and this happens in a lot of the developing world, this is where we see we're failing in our duty to make sure that they can make that choice for themselves. And we have very good examples that we hope SheDecides can also help bring people together to discuss and share. During the launch of, or rather the SheDecides flagship event here on March 1st, we had people from all over the region sharing these stories. And Nepal has a fantastic movement of women's organizations, of UN and others who were able to bring good practices that the rest of us can learn from. And that's the power of a movement like this, is bringing people to come together to share what is working, to share what is not working, but also bring people who've not normally been at the table. Young people, for example, are normally left out of decisions that are being made about their own lives. But for SheDecides, we say that this movement has young people at its heart. And so with them there, we can talk about what does it mean to have youth-friendly services, for example, where they are not intimidated or discriminated against when they go to a clinic to ask questions. Young people can help us to understand what do they want to know as part of comprehensive sexuality education in schools and out of schools. We also have to understand that not all young people, for example, are the same. We have young people, we have women who live with disabilities. We have some that are in very hard to reach areas, in the rural areas, and a lot of policies don't get implemented well when it's very far from the urban centers, for example. And so we need very specific strategies to make sure nobody's left behind. This is how we're going to bring to life something like the ICPD, the Program of Action, the Sustainable Development Goals, is by really making sure that it touches and benefits the lives of women and girls, but of those who normally get left behind. Yeah.
Any specific intervention engaging, lawmakers, the parliamentarians?
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, there was a news story in Nepal. One of the women parliamentarians, of the view that women or girls should be married before 18 years, straightening the cultural and religious taboos here in Nepal. So how can one or she deal with such cultural and religious taboos in the countries, where there are close cultural and religious practices are taking place?
Yeah. We also had one of your parliamentarians at our SheDecides event, and she said something very interesting. She said that we have, when we talk about change the rules, they are the written rules or the formal rules and the informal rules. And the formal rules are the ones that are in law and policy, but the informal are the ones in culture, in custom, where even if you have a law that says something, so long as people believe something else, it's going to be very difficult to change behavior. And this has been a struggle in this journey towards bodily autonomy, that a lot of cultures believe that it is the right of the community or the right of men or somebody else's right to decide on behalf of women and girls. And we're trying to change that because that is one of the biggest barriers. And what we really believe is that culture can never be used as an excuse to oppress anybody. And definitely it can never be used as an excuse to deny women and girls the rights to choose. And so what we're learning is that if we start to have a dialogue with cultural leaders and other influencers within the community to actually say that this is something that is causing great harm to families, to communities, but definitely to women and girls themselves. If you marry a girl off before age 18, you are likely to send her off into a life of poverty, which will have impact on her own children and their chances of finishing school and escaping poverty. It has impact on what that woman can contribute to the economy. Because she's been married off before she finished school, she cannot make economic decisions. So it has a huge impact on our society. And once we begin to have that conversation, we can begin to kind of undo some of the thinking that has been there that has really harmed part of our society. So for She Decides, again, we want to make sure that everybody who needs to be part of the conversation needs to be at the table. Let's have a dialogue. Let's start to change the rules.
Well, going through the reference of your movement, She Decides,
Yes.
could you suggest us with, some recommendations to the government of Nepal or other governments across this region?
Yeah.
How can the harassment, oppression
Yeah.
of violence against women
Yeah.
be stopped?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, you have amazing organizations working here in Nepal that are doing such a fantastic job. We worked, for example, with the Beyond Beijing Committee on She Decides and others. And as She Decides, what we would say is, let's start to think differently. Let's start to come together. Where we have been working separately, let's start to have one conversation. In this next week, we're actually going to have a discussion with many from Nepal civil society, but also the UN and some in government. Because I think as She Decides, what it does is provides a platform to bring people together who have been working in separate ways over time, but who perhaps have gotten stuck sometimes to move a law or to move a behavior or a norm. So I would say, and I would encourage the government to engage with all the different groups to make sure that there are young people at the table, to listen to the evidence, because there's a lot of research that is showing what needs to be done, but to really be open to change, to see what needs to happen to make sure that not one more girl gets married before she chooses, not one more girl or woman has to have an unsafe abortion. What needs to happen? Because we have the solutions. The solutions will not come from outside Nepal. They will come from here, so long as we begin to have the conversation and have one commitment to make it work.
There is often criticism over, movements of not only She Decides, but many civil society movements across the world, that the resources do not reach out to the needy people. How do you ensure that the activities that you engage actually benefiting the needy ones, the youngsters, youths, and those who are in need to know about these all movements?
Absolutely. I think that's why She Decides was not started as an organization. It's not an NGO. We are actually trying to bring organizations together, because that's a very good point, that a lot of times the people who should be part of the discussion are not. And that includes different groups, sometimes even the private sector. The private sector, who plays a very big role in health, are normally not involved in conversations about health. They're very much working separately on the business side, and the NGOs are working on the rights side. But how come they're not having this conversation? Governments with young people, media, celebrities. I mean, there's so many people who can be here beyond just NGOs. And that's what She Decides is trying to do. And we don't create chapters or anything. We're not trying to create any new structures, because there's already so much going on. What we are trying to do is just change the way this has been discussed, because we want to have this to be a much more positive, empowering conversation that makes sure that it's action-driven, with political commitment, resources. And so if we can enable everyone to come together, we definitely encourage movements, because movements are springing up on their own. We're not designing them in any way, but people see the power of something like She Decides. And we therefore have a guide on our website you can find. It's a guide for local movements that encourages people to think through how to make sure they're not only in the capital cities, for example, or that they're not talking to who they've always spoken to, or that it's not one organization that becomes She Decides, because that's not what it is. It's a platform for conversation. It started off because of the Trump global gag rule. It became a hashtag, it became a conference, and then it became a movement, because everybody feels a very strong connection to making the world better and safer and stronger. And so that's what we're encouraging people to do. So you can find that information on our website, on SheDecides.com, the local movement guide that can help you to think through how to move in Nepal, for example.
How do you observe the state of, the implementation of the laws and international commitments of the, UN state members in relations to violence against women or any oppression taking place in different parts of the world against girls and women?
Yeah. Yes, that's been our struggle, isn't it? That we really sign on to very ambitious and exciting commitments at the global level, and then we come home and somehow they don't get implemented, or if they do get implemented, they don't get resourced. But I think that needs to change, and I think that's definitely one of the issues we're looking at this year with the International Conference on Population and Development, for example. In Nairobi in November, there's going to be the summit where the international community will come together to see how they've done 25 years after the ICPD. And this is accountability is a very strong part of what we're trying to do as She Decides, is to really say that these are not just words on paper. This is actually about changing lives and bringing back that freedom, that dignity that everybody is born with. These are not new rights. We're saying you need to respect what already exists. And so one of the things we've done this year, which is very exciting, is we got 25 young people from 25 different countries.
Here in Nepal?
Yes, who are all aged 25. So they were born when ICPD was being discussed, because they're the ones who are now working on making sure their governments deliver the dream of ICPD, for example. And they're going to come to Nairobi to actually have this conversation with their governments and with others. But they're also going to work in their countries so that people start to know this was a commitment. This right to bodily autonomy, to be free from violence, to make these choices, this was already guaranteed 25 years ago. So what have you been doing as a government? And what have you been doing as a leader, as an MP? That kind of accountability has to happen. And I think we also need to see very strong commitments where people actually begin to take action, especially around resources. What we're finding, for example, is something like family planning is tremendously under-resourced. There's just not enough money. So people know they have a right to access it, but then you go to the clinic and the public health clinic and they have no commodities. So those are the very specific things that governments can do, is put budget lines that actually will deliver on that policy commitment. It's for citizens to know what it is so that they can hold the government accountable. And it's for us also to make sure we're thinking about this differently. This is not just words on a paper. This is lives. Yeah.
Well, there are many interesting issues, but we are coming to the end of the show. Yeah. Do you have to share with our audience anything that I have left to ask you very quickly?
No, I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, and I'm very excited about what She Decides can become here in Nepal. There's been so much excitement over the last week, and we stand ready as the support unit to support anything that will rise up from She Decides here in Nepal, including you, Laxman. I hope you will join us.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Likimani. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Laxman.
Dear audience, time now to wrap up the show. Keep watching us. See you next week. Namaste.